Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, and you can find us at our website, thewww.wine. You can also find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. Every week, Mark and I talk about trending topics in the wine world, and we also speak to interesting personalities in the wine world as well, whether they are from our United States or from other parts of the world. How are you today, Mark?
Everything's great, Kim. How are you?
I'm pretty good, and I'm very excited that we have our special guest today is Randy Caparoso, who is joining us from Lodi, California. He is an author, a photographer, a sommelier, a journalist, lots of things to talk about with Randy as far as wine in general, Lodi specifically. How are you, Randy? Welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm great.
You're out in California, correct?
California and
Wonderful.
Lodi, and I guess a lot of people don't even know where that is because it's not Napa Valley or Sonoma or even Santa Barbara. Lodi is halfway between the capital of Sacramento and the city of Stockton, right in between, and just east of the California Delta.
Randy, that was one of the things I wanted to ask you right off the top. I loved your book, Lodi. This is basically an all-inclusive guide to everything Lodi and a real diving deep into the region. And I wanted to first start with your background. Can you tell the listeners about your wine background? I read a lot about you where you loved wine at a very young age. You were a sommelier in Hawaii, and I learned a lot of interesting things about that. I'd like you to tell the listeners your background, please.
Well, it does go back over 45 years, but like a lot of people, I worked my way through college in restaurants and fell in love through staff wine tastings with wine, studied philosophy in school, but got married at the age of 21 and picked a career, and I decided to become a sommelier. And so I've been full-time in wine-related businesses ever since, and mostly, in fact, in restaurants. I co-own, as a partner, a group of restaurants called Roy's, R-O-Y apostrophe S, and open up those type of restaurants, nearly 30 of them from Tokyo to New York back in the 80s and 90s. I am now living in Lodi and as a full-time journalist in the middle of the largest wine region in the United States in terms of amount of acres, not in geographically the largest. And I guess that summarizes it. And so it's all wine, wine, wine for me.
Nice. I read that Hawaii was actually where the first two master sommeliers came from. Is that true?
Yes, and the first combination MSMW also.
Huh.
I believe he was the seventh MS. So back in the 70s, Hawaii was the hot spot for wine industry. And, there weren't a lot of sommeliers around in the 70s, but we had them in Hawaii. And in those days, if you wanted to become a master sommelier, you had to go all the way to London to take an exam. And that's what these guys did. And so these are the guys that worked with in the 70s. Quite respectable. Unfortunately, the first two MSs have passed away recently. So now they live in history.
Your website, I'm on the lodiwine.com website, which you are deeply involved in writing their blog, covers so many different aspects of wine and the region specifically, but also a lot of the things that we talk about on the show, which is trending topics in the wine world. What are the numbers showing? What are people actually consuming? Where do you kind of get your focus for what should be something that is talked about in your blog kind of immediately? Like, what's your thought process for what the next blog should be?
Well, I'm always working on something, but what I try to focus is defining Lodi as a wine growing region for consumers because, honestly, it's not as well defined in people's minds as the Napa Valley or Sonoma County. And there are multiple reasons for that. One is Lodi is say, as large as all of Sonoma County and Napa Valley combined in terms of grape acreage. It's more than all of Washington State and Oregon combined, plus another 25% or so.
Wow.
So just a lot of grapes grown out here. But as you might assume, there's a lot of grapes here because this is where a lot of America's or California's value price wines are grown. So the wines that you might see in your supermarkets or those big package stores where there's always great buys, buy this and buy that. The wines that most people actually drink, which is somewhere between $8 and $18 a bottle, they're grown here. And that is the reason why Lodi is a large wine growing region. So here's the thing, folks. If you went back 30, 40, 50 years, and they had large wine companies then, like Gallo, Parmesan, or Italian Swiss Colony, old timers will remember those where you bought these big jug wines. Most of those grapes actually came from regions like Napa Valley and Sonoma County. Gallo by itself took more than half the grapes in those two regions. The situation changed very quickly by the late 80s and 1990s. And so now Gallo cannot make a $9 or $10 wine from a Napa Valley vineyard. It's just not going to happen because of costs and land values and everything having to do with that. If you grow a grape in Napa, it's going to be a $50 or $100 wine. If you grow a grape in Sonoma, it's going to be a $35 to a $75 wine. So those things have changed. And so in the 1980s and 1990s, people like Gallo and Mondavi all came out to Lodi. Interestingly, Robert Mondavi originally grew up in Lodi. His father was a grape packer in Lodi, but they became famous because they bought wineries in Napa Valley. The reason why jug wine grapes used to come from Napa and Sonoma wasn't because those were really jug wine regions, at least the way most people think of it, which is lower quality regions. It's because they were grape wine regions where the grapes grow really well, ripen, and produce wines that are very intense and fresh and flavorful. And that's the reason why they came out to Lodi, because of the quality of the terroir or the environment. A lot of people nowadays, they know that Lodi is associated with old vines. There are more old vineyards in Lodi than anywhere else in California. And I'm talking about pre-1960s vineyards and going back all the way to the late 1800s. There's more of that here than anywhere. Over 40% of Zinfandel is in California is grown in Lodi. Now you have to start putting two and two together. There's a reason why. And that's because the environment in Lodi is very conducive, number one, to Mediterranean grapes, and number two, to very healthy grapevines. And so you can have a 100-year-old grapevine that's still productive, rather than the situation in most wine regions where after 25, 30 years, you have to pull a vineyard out and restart because the grapevines die. And so this is all testimony toward the region itself. It's a good place to grow grapes. Now, here's another thing a lot of people aren't aware of, but it's important to the wine industry. Lodi grows over 130 different grapes that go into wine on a commercial scale. And that's a lot of grapes. It's more than just the 6 or 10 most people are familiar with. And again, that is because the region is conducive to wine growing. All those add up to what makes Lodi Lodi. Now, here's the thing. I also know that over there on the East Coast, a lot of people associate Lodi with just inexpensive wine of average quality, and that's what Lodi grows. But I'm sure you also talk about the more handcraft wines coming out of Lodi with brands like Turley or Sandlands or Harmeyer or Saint Amant. Those are the handcrafty things. It's a sort of a situation, you go back to the 60s in Napa Valley or in Sonoma, where there are big producers like Louis Martini or Sebastiani and Inglenook, and they produce a lot of $7, $8 wine, and they produce a lot of it. But then they started producing reserve type wines that are more handcrafty. It's the same kind of situation as it was in Napa in the 60s and 70s, where there are now also finer wines that are more terroir expressive and very, very unique. They're pure. And what I mean by pure is maybe a lot of it is minimal intervention. So you can really taste the place. You can really taste the hand of the craftsman or the artist or the winemaker or whatever you want to call it. So Lodi is doing that. It's producing artistic wines that express the place while most of the grapes still go into lower price or value price wines that you see in the supermarkets. So that's what's interesting about the region.
Yeah. I will say that from an East Coast perspective, not necessarily living near California where we might have a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of the regions, Lodi does have a particular reputation of having a style that expresses the terroir. Certainly when people in wine circles talk about Lodi Zinfandel or Lodi blends, kind of have this picture in our minds of something that is fruit forward, balanced, intense, maybe a little bit higher in alcohol, but there certainly is an understanding that there is a typical terroir characteristic of the wines. And I don't think that we all think of them as cheap wines, but that there is a uniqueness to the wines from the region.
And a lot of that, Kim, I'll tell you this, is because, when people try to understand the entire world of wines, wines from everywhere around the world, they tend to simplify things.
Sure.
Like you look at South Australia or South Africa or even Chile, and you think, oh, those are warm climate regions, and so the wines are ripe and heavy and high in alcohol. But anyone who has kept up with the wines from those regions know that isn't entirely true.
Right.
You can make very fine and delicate and high acid wines from these regions. And that's because the hand of man plays a major part. And plus, it really is not that simple. Just this morning, I was tasting a couple of Grüner Veltliners from Austria. And, one was on the ripe side and soft and kind of a rich pineapple sort of taste. And the other one was something you might expect, very minerally and crisp and a little spicy. I compared them actually to two recently bottled Grüner Veltliners grown in Lodi. And let me tell you, if I was doing it in a blind tasting, I would have thought the Lodi wines were from Austria, because I sound like I'm from Dumb and Dumber. I can't separate Austria from Australia. And that's because the Lodi wines were actually higher in acid. They were lighter. They had more mineral, almost of a briny minerality, and they were more tart, frankly. The normal way of thinking that, a hot region always produces higher alcohol, low acid wine is just plain wrong, because it isn't always that way. And so this is what we try to talk about a lot when it comes to Lodi. Some of the lightest and crispest and finest white wines grown and made in California come out of Lodi. Not only that, there's proof. You go blind tasting competitions where you have maybe 2,000 white wines. Well, quite often the top wine comes from Lodi. Why? Because they're light, crisp, and very fine. Just what the judges are looking for. So a lot of it has to do with grape growing. A lot of it has to do with skill. A lot of it has to do with winemaker decisions. But Lodi is not a desert. The climate in Lodi is actually very similar to the climate in the eastern part of Sonoma County, the mid to upper parts of Napa Valley, most of Mendocino County and Livermore Valley. Just so many assumptions that people make. And a lot of it is because they don't know where Lodi is. They know Lodi is somewhere in the Central Valley, but they don't know that the only thing that separates Lodi from the San Francisco Bay, where all that cool air comes in, is the California Delta. And it is a delta like other deltas. It's below sea level. So there's no mountain impediment. And so Lodi has the same kind of climatic influence as many parts of the coastal regions of California. And that's what we try to go over and over again with people in our blog, in our stories, and in the 500-page book that you have.
Randy, you mentioned so many things about Lodi, and you mentioned all this in the book, but I just want to ask you this. a lot of growers, a lot of wineries, 130 plus grapes, 74% of wines sold in the US, $10 and under, come from that region. There was a song written about it by John Fogerty. So why is it still so hard for you to get the word out? Why is it still a new or
Look,
unknown region?
because logic kind of tells people that, oh, if low price, inexpensive wine comes from a region, it must be a lousy region. Lower price wines come out of Provence in the Languedoc-Roussillon. But you and I know there's a lot of great wines grown in Provence. Languedoc-Roussillon, Sicily, all over Spain. Sure, there's a lot of $5 wine in Spain, but there's a lot of great $50, $100, $200 wine in Spain. So this is what people, because they're unfamiliar, they tend to jump to the conclusions that are in error, not just about Lodi, but about all these regions: South Africa, Chile, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia. In the most cases, great wine regions tend to be underestimated because it's hard for people to break through in the layering and the complexities of these regions and all the terroirs and subregions and the grape varieties, and not to mention the talent and wherewithals and investments put in by people. It's hard for them to break through all that. And so it's easier to make conclusions. So right now, for California, it's all about, oh, Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay make the finest wine. Well, I guess you could say it's true, but, honestly, I don't think so, because there are a lot of other grape varieties and there are a lot of other regions besides Napa and Sonoma. For God's sake, the sideways try to teach. There's a place called Santa Barbara where they grow a grape called Pinot Noir. People happen to think that's a pretty good wine. All these things, it takes time to change. So here's another funny thing, though. A lot of people, whether you drink wine or not, I've heard about this thing called global warming. And it is true. A lot of regions are anticipating changes in climate. Now, in Bordeaux, they now grow an extra 7 or 8 grape varieties like Albarino or in other Mediterranean grapes, because they're anticipating that maybe in 40, 50 years, we can't live alone just on Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet, Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot. We're going to have to start looking at other grape varieties. Climatologists are expecting certain regions along the coast, such as Willamette Valley or Santa Barbara or Sonoma or Napa, to have the same climate as what Lodi has right now in about 40, 50 years. And it's kind of brutal to think about. But you have to kind of face reality of things, just like everyone's facing reality of hurricanes and rains and forest fires going crazy. So I'm bringing that up because you know what the climatologists are also concluding right now? In 40, 50 years, Lodi's climate is going to remain the same. That's only because of where it's at in terms of the Delta and then being just west of the Sierra Nevadas. It will always have that coastal influence, and it's not going to be affected as much by hotter climates. So things are going to change, but I don't expect Lodi to change, which is kind of encouraging. And I fear, because my favorite wine happens to be Pinot Noir. And so we might have to buy our Pinot Noirs from other places besides Russian River in Sonoma, but because they're going to be warmer. And so we'll see, but I don't even know why I'm saying that. I'm 68 years old now, so I'm not going to be here in 50 years, most likely. But some people will be.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio. You can find all about us on our website, thewww.wine. Today, we have a very special guest, Randy Caparoso. Randy can be found on his website for his book at kitchencincopress.com. You can also read his blogs on lodiwine.com/blog. You can find our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes. Welcome back. Today we're talking with Randy Caparoso. He has a very good book about Lodi. It's called Lodi, The Definitive Guide in History of America's Largest Wine Growing Region. A lot of interesting information, Randy, you've been talking about. And I still have so many questions. We're never going to get them all in. I had read that the oldest plantings in Lodi actually have a Massachusetts connection. Can you talk about that to our listeners?
Well, all of California has a Massachusetts connection. California became a state in 1850. And that's like only 1 year after we got the place from Mexico. At that time, because, there's so much discourse in Washington about whether you're going to be a slave state or not. So they fast-tracked it. And then there was gold discovered, 1848. And so everyone, not just around the country, were rushing in all over the world also came rushing into California with visions of riches, as well as they knew it was a good place, especially to farm, because America was still kind of a rural country still, and people are looking for farming land. So they heard about that too. So thereby, many of these people were Europeans, and Europeans, where you have Europeans, you need grapes. And why do you need grapes? Because you need wine. So starting really in the late 1840s and 1850s, people started growing grapes. Multiple nurseries in California, from Los Angeles and Stockton in the north of the Bay, started bringing grapes from nurseries in Boston. So finally, I get around to that Massachusetts connection. That is where all European grape varieties were sourced. Boston was the hot place when it came to stock of wine grapes. And a lot of it was influenced by the Brits over there in London. Boston was the place where you got grapes. And so they were the main channel. And so they started growing lots of grapes in California. By the 1880s and 1890s, there are probably a good 100 different grape varieties grown. So they were trying everything. So it's funny how it turns out. A lot of people know from history that the grape that proved to be the best out of the 90 or 100 grape varieties that were popular and planted up and down the state, the grape variety that was popular, did the best, was Zinfandel. Up until the 1960s and 70s, wine buffs know that Zinfandel used to be called a mystery grape because no one knew where in the hell it came from. All they know is they did get the cuttings from Boston nurseries, but the Bostonians are the ones that lost its origin. But thanks to accidental findings and DNA testing by the 1970s and 80s, grape scientists were able to decide that Zinfandel came from southern Italy, but originated in Croatia. And so with unpronounceable names there. In Italy, it was called Primitivo. Here's the thing about that. The reason why Zinfandel grew well there, it was always the same. A vineyard might plant 10, 20, 30 different grape varieties. Try them all, and Zinfandel makes the best wine. And that's because it is a grape that comes from that Adriatic Mediterranean area. And most of California on the coast, where there are vineyards, are Mediterranean climate region. Lodi has a Mediterranean climate region, but it's a little different from the coast because we don't have fog in the summer. And so our grapes see sun the minute that rises up above the Sierras and dumps down into the sea. So that's the only difference between Lodi and some of the coastal regions, which characterizes the Lodi style of wine. Lots of sun, very bright.
Yeah, and you can't not mention Lodi and talk about Zinfandel. But what's happened over the years with this? I mean, in the 80s and 90s, this was the hot grape. White Zinfandel was selling like crazy. It was like the Thanksgiving wine everybody recommended. What's going on with the popularity? Is it not as popular in that region as it doesn't seem as popular here?
No, the consumer always speaks. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, what did consumers drink? They drank Blue Nun, they drank Black Castle, they drank Lancers and Matus Rosé from Portugal. They drank fruity wines, very light, Riunite on ice, for God's sake. And then if they drank California wine, it was jug wine. But then Napa Valley guys changed the whole picture, and all of a sudden it's all about Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon, which is good because that means people had good taste. And then 20 years later, maybe Pinot Noir. But consumer changes. I distinctly remember, because I was working in the restaurant industry at the time, when white Zinfandel became popular. It was experimental in the late 60s and early 70s. By 1984-85, it only took one or two wineries like Sutter Home to popularize that sweet, fruity style of pink Zinfandel. So it was basically a rosé with about anywhere from 2 to 4% residual sugar. People loved that. But honestly, people have since gotten tired of it. White Zinfandel sales started to drop in the early 2000s, and pretty quickly too, I might add. And a lot of people will say that a lot of the old vine plantings of Zinfandel, not only in Lodi but all over California, might have disappeared long ago if not for the fact that white Zinfandel was popular, because even 100-year-old vineyards still producing Zinfandel were being used for white Zinfandel in the 80s and 1990s. So that changed too. Now people appreciate old vine Zinfandels, and that's become sort of the thing. And the best don't really say old vine on it. They have a name of a vineyard. If you put a name of the vineyard, it means most of the time that you don't have to put old vine, because that kind of says, hey, this is a special Zinfandel because it comes from a vineyard, and most likely it's an older vineyard, because the older vineyards, when it comes to Zinfandel, are the ones that make the better wine. So Zinfandel is certainly, even here in Lodi, we're pulling out a lot of Zinfandel vineyards, and a lot of those vineyards were planted in 1980s and 1990s to make white Zinfandel. But the better ones that are planted before the 1960s, they're going to hang around because there's value in the vineyard designate type of wines. And as you know, wineries like Ridge and Ravenswood and where they kind of pioneered that whole idea of special terroir focused sort of Zinfandel. Hopefully that will never disappear. And so these old vineyards, I mean, going back, the oldest one is in Amador County. It goes back to 1869, for Pete's sake. Hopefully it will always be in demand, because who wants to see an 1869 vineyard pulled out because nobody wants it?
Let's talk about that term, Randy, about old vine, because in the United States, the TTB really has no definition of old vine, but in
No, it doesn't mean.
Lodi, you do have a definition of it in Lodi.
No, well, still unofficial, but it's unofficial all around the world too. Like Vieux Vin from France. What does that mean? Well, you could say it's old because it's 30 years old, or you could say it's old because it's 100 years old. And so, not even the French control that. It's just like saying reserve. What does that mean? It could be your cheapest $5 wine, or it could be your most expensive $200 wine. You still want to call it reserve, and you know what? You have the right.
Right. But you do have a standard in Lodi, correct?
Well, we don't have, no, we don't. I will say this. There is an organization. It's now about almost 10 years old. It's called the Historic Vineyard Society, and it was started by specialists in old vine type winemaking. And here in California, it's Historic Vineyard Society is strictly California. And they have a definition, and their definition is at least a third of a given vineyard must be at least 50 years old. So that's sort of their cutoff. But a lot of it was historical, because 10 years ago, when they first conceived of the Historic Vineyard Society, they were thinking that, well, viticulture sort of changed in the mid 1960s and 70s. And so at that time, if a vineyard was over 50 years old, chances are it was planted before changes in the 60s and 70s. And those changes were like use of more aggressive rootstock, more trellising, and very few plantings that were head trained or just grown on a single stake. And because you planted a vineyard after 1965 or 1970, you put it on a trellis. And because that's what everyone was telling you, that's the best way to grow vineyards. So that's the standard. There's an old vine registry that the Brits have sort of started just last year. And their cutoff actually for old vines is 35 years. So if you're a 40-year-old vineyard, you're an old vine. And so that's because in some parts of the world, a 35 or 40-year-old vineyard is old. Like South Africa, they have old vines, but they don't have so many of the 100 and 150-year-old vines like California and Australia has. And so to them, 35 or 50 years old is very old. And that's all there is to it. People in Spain, as well in France, are starting to look at a little bit more regimented guideline sort of thoughts on what constitutes old vines. But here we have sort of a voluntary system in the Historic Vineyard Society.
I'm learning a whole lot here about the region. And the only thing that was kind of stuck in the back of my mind was from something that you said at the very beginning of the show about the appropriateness of the terroir for producing those old vines. What is it about the region that contributes to the longevity of those vines? Does anybody know from like a scientific perspective?
Of course. I mean, these things are studied day and night. So Mediterranean climate is number one. It's a climate, basically, it just means cold, wet winters and warm, dry summers. That's all it is. But in California, it takes it to an nth degree, even more so than around the Mediterranean in Europe, and which is we have steep diurnal swings where a nighttime temperature could be as anywhere from 30, 35 degrees to 50 degrees cooler than a daytime temperature. When grapes grow under those kind of conditions, they tend to retain acidity. And acidity is what makes for really great grape growing and really good wine, because the grapes, which are translated into wines, can retain a freshness of their fruit character. So that's the Mediterranean climate zones of California. That's what they do. They do everything that you find in France and Spain or Italy, but with even more extreme diurnal swing. That's the reason why a lot of people prefer California wines. They have a lot of fruit expression. They aren't necessarily hotter climates than Provence or Sicily, but they have that day and night variant that are more extreme. And then of course, terroir also means everything. Topography, it means soil especially. It also means the traditions and input put in by people, because grape vineyards aren't put in by themselves, they're put in by people. So farming practices and traditions are very much a part of what we call terroir. Topography, altitude, soil is extremely important. Lodi's old vineyards happen to grow in a very strange part of the world where there's a sandy loam. So it's very sandy, like a beach, but it's a loam because it's alluvial. So there's a lot of vigor and richness in the soil. So it's all mixed up. But it's not just a sandy loam, because you can find sandy loam all over the world, because it's a really good soil for grapes, because grapes like well-drained soils. In Lodi, it's as much as 100 feet deep. So you probably heard, Pinot Noir in Russian River Valley, it grows in gold-ridge soils, which is a sandy loam. And the Pinot Noir grows great there, and it most certainly does. It produces spectacular, perfumey wines, but that gold-ridge soil is only a few feet deep. And so Lodi, this is where Lodi gets weird. It's 100 feet deep. That means 100 feet of just sandy loam, no rocks, no gravel. You couldn't pick up a rock to hurt someone. So that's where it's different. You find a lot of sandy loam, by the way, up and down Val Central in Chile, which is why they have a lot of own-rooted vines there. So that's connected. A lot of people know that phylloxera, which destroyed most of the wine industry around the world by the 1880s, causing the use of American rootstocks on European grape varieties. A lot of people know that phylloxera might exist, but it doesn't thrive in sandy soil. So that's the reason why most of Lodi's old vineyards, over 50 years old or even over 100 years old, are still growing on their own rootstocks, because they never had a problem with phylloxera. So there's a lot of things involved here, but that make this region special, but in a similar way that other regions around the world are special, of course.
Randy, my last question for you is, a lot of wine drinkers may read a review about a Lodi wine and see the terms east and west side of Lodi. Can you explain that to the listeners?
Well, first of all, you're only going to have that factor play in the handcraft wines, usually with the vineyard designates. Sadly, though, a lot of the Zinfandel that you see out there on the coast are bulk wine type blends that big companies put together, and they slap on the brand that we never see here on the West Coast, but that's grown all over the East Coast. But the factor of east side, west side is a very, very subtle thing. It's like the difference between Pauillac and Saint Julien compared to Margaux. It's this soil-related thing. So here on Lodi, in the old part of Lodi, we have a city. It's called Lodi. There's about 70,000 people that live here. And on the west side, closer to the delta, the sandy loam happens to be a little richer because it's closer to the delta region, where it's all dammed up just to keep the water from, because normally the delta is covered with water. It's because it's below sea level. Then there's the east side, which is a little closer to the Sierra foothills, a little away from the delta. And there the soil is a little sandier and maybe not quite as rich, but it's more well drained. And so if you grow Zinfandel on the west side compared to the east side, you're going to make actually a different wine. It could be subtle, but it's a difference between, like I said, a Pauillac and a Saint Julien, which might be next to each other, and they make different wine because of the soil differences.
And what is the dividing line? Is it a railroad or a river?
It's a railroad that runs right smack through the middle of the city of Lodi. It's a very historic one. So they built the railroad on sort of a high ground. So that's why it's a good demarcation. And so the east side tends to come from the sandier soils. And so the Zinfandels are more perfumey, very fragrant, lots of red berry cherry. The ones on the west can have black fruits, a blackberry, a raspberry, or a blacker cherry, and they're also earthier. And so you never find earthy qualities. When I mean by earthy, it's earthy. It's like if you work in your garden, you know what earth smells like. It smells like the compost that you put in your garden. And so the ones on the west side would have a little composty, earthy things. Some I've even called it poopy diaper. It's different. You never find earthiness in the east side, and that's because it's just a little sandier. Those are just phenomenons having to do with slight differences in soil. And it's a phenomenon that you find all over the world, the regions where there are great wine, quite often. And you can go to the Russian River Valley, for instance, and grow Pinot Noir on a parcel, but it will be dramatically different on this side of the road compared to that side of the road, only because there's a slight change in soil and maybe the slant of the soil. So many things. So this east-west side thing in Lodi is no different than the phenomenon that you find in all the great wine regions of the world. Soil has a huge impact. And a lot of people wonder, wow, it's just soil. How does it make an impact? Well, let me tell you, folks, it makes an impact, say, on a cluster morphology, the size of the cluster, the weight of the cluster, the size of the berries, the canopy, how the canopies grow. All these little things add up into making a wine that tastes a little bit different, even though it's made from the same grape variety. And that's why people love wine, right? It's the terroir. It's all the little things that add up to make wine so interesting.
Randy, thank you. Thank you so much. And our listeners can tell his passion for Lodi. It's in his book. He has phenomenal photography that he does. He puts in the book. So Randy, thank you very much for your time and telling our listeners about Lodi. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Wonderful World of Wine today. We have been your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, with special guest Randy Caparoso. You can find more information about myself and Mark on our website, thewww.wine. You can find our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. More information about Randy can be found on lodiwine.com/blog, and more information about his Lodi book can be found at kitchencincopress.com. Cheers.
Cheers.
Wine, wine.